I'm Barbara. When you talk about giant rock, it's an interesting story because it has so many different layers. That's the part about giant rock that gets really increasingly almost frustrating, because what do you want to know? Do you want to know about George Van Tassel, or do you want to know about Frank Kreitzer, or do you want to know about the geology of giant rock? So in my presentation, I give you a little bit of everything. I break it down into the geology, the Native Americans, homesteading, Charlie Ritchie, mining, Frank Kreitzer, George Van Tassel, the spacecraft conventions, the Integratron, the split, and then we get into the present day. We get into the spiritualism, we get into the graffiti, and the illegal dumping. How are we going to preserve giant rock? It's been there for millions of years, and at the rate it's going, it's going to be lucky if it's going to be there another 50. The original giant rock was once considered the largest freestanding boulder in the world. Now, I put freestanding boulder because you'll have people that will say, well, what about Ayers Rock in Australia? And I go, well, that's not a freestanding boulder. A freestanding boulder is just like a giant rock that shows itself up and is standing there in the middle of the desert. Okay, they said it covered an area of 5,800 square feet. It weighed approximately 25 tons. I beg to differ. I think it probably weighed more. It stood 7 stories high, and it was formed by volcanic magma, and it's granite. It's a granite, and it was once considered very sacred by the Native Americans. And I bring up the Native Americans of this area because there are some history books that will write about the Hopis in this area. I'm going to let you know that the Hopis did not have any contact with this area. For this Morongo Basin, we have the tribes that intermingled in the Morongo Basin were the Chimwebe, the Serrano, the Mojave, and the Cahuilla. Okay, those were primarily the Native American tribes that interacted in this whole desert area. That includes this northern part and the southern part down in the Palm Springs area. For the most part, the Native Americans that did come to this area, they would use giant rock as an area and they considered it a holy ground. And it was considered a place like a stop-off on their way from Yuma to Big Bear. And it's mainly seasonal. And it would be a time that they would go and they would conduct ceremony there. As it was written by George Van Tassel, the tribes themselves would be sent off and they would not be allowed to be at the rock. And only the shamans and the chiefs were allowed to spend time at the rock. And they would conduct ceremony and be there for up to 3 days. I have tried to find out and get this documented of what tribes were at Giant Rock, what is the background to this story. And to this very day, I cannot get this story validated. So the only way this story has ever been really validated was from the writings of George Van Tassel in his booklets, and what he has basically said about the Native American tribes that have been to Giant Rock. And he also made a statement about the giant rock. And I don't know if many of you know this, but there is an imprint of a scorpion up on the side of the rock. Then it is a petroglyph that has been put there. Van Tassel said it was put there by a tribesman, by a chief, and he was probably one of the last chiefs who was there. And to have a scorpion put on the side of the rock is a very significant sign, because a scorpion is sacred. It is a totem that is meant for healing. Charlie Ritchie was the first white man to be invited to participate with the Native Americans at Giant Rock in the ceremonies. And he was a sheriff in the last posse of the Willie Boy Hunt. And he owned the ranch where the Integratron sits. And why that ranch was so important is because it was the only ranch in this area that had water. And there you go, there's Goat Mountain, and here's where the Integratron sits today. This is a really special part of the land because this was the only water for a very long time in this area. This mountain, Goat Mountain, is also a very, very special part and plays a very significant role in the UFO story of this area. Charlie Ritchie homesteaded in this area in 1887. So he was like the first white man to come into this area. He also became friends with the first prospector in the area, which happened to be Frank Kreitzer. And he also eventually sold his ranch to George Van Tassel in 1951. So here's how it all breaks down for me. If you didn't have this man, Charlie Ritchie, the first white man in this area, this guy, Frank Kreitzer, and that guy, George Van Tassel, these are the three guys that actually made up the history of Giant Rock and really made up the history starting in this area that started out there at the Ritchie Ranch and at Giant Rock. And it was because of these three guys that you got the history that you got now. Now, most of it will start with who is Frank Kreitzer? And most of you, when you probably heard about Frank Kreitzer, you probably read about him being in a little booklet that, again, George Van Tassel wrote. And he wrote about him being a German who came over here, who had lung problems, and it just was a lot of untruths. For years, they were written down in booklets, on websites, in newspapers, and it was the same stuff being regurgitated over and over again. See this picture? When I first started doing research, this was the only picture I could find of Frank Kreitzer, okay? And you look and you go, wait, there's got to be more information on this guy. There's got to be more stuff happening. So fortunately, when I first started checking into all this, I had an opportunity of actually talking to Frank Kreitzer's great nephew. And I found out a few things about Frank Kreitzer. For one thing, the one thing that you will read about Frank Kreitzer is he was not born in America, and he was a German. You would read things that he was in the German Merchant Marines. You'll read things that he came here, and there's all kind. There were a lot of stories written about him. But once I started digging into it and got information directly from his family, we were able to start putting pieces together as to who Frank Kreitzer really was. And the first thing you found out was that Frank Kreitzer was not a German spy, for one thing, and he wasn't German. Frank Kreitzer was actually born in Basic City, Virginia in 1885. And why probably nobody ever broke that down or find it is because there was never any Social Security Act till 1935. So there was never any records prior to that. He came from a rather large family, and the documentations were founded later on in the 1940 census. These were sent to me, showing of his background and where he came from. And we've kind of broke it down to show that he really did exist. This up here, which I'm showing you, is part of his family tree. He had 8 brothers and sisters. And then this was part of his family tree that broke down. Now, he was originally born in Virginia, but his whole family eventually moved to Kansas. And what apparently happened when he was in Kansas, that he did join the army at the time, and he was kicked out. He was kicked out because he was kind of had a background as a German sympathizer. So, and that was during World War I. So he had that went back to him when he was in Kansas. And then as some of the story went, he had kind of a jilted lover, and he just didn't want to live in Kansas anymore. So he put his dog in the car, which happened to be this little thing right here. Look at that. That was a 1942 Essex. Can you imagine? Okay, so you go way back then, and you're driving from Kansas to California in one of those in the middle of summer. 120, it's like riding a bicycle. Oh my gosh, who does that? Okay, so here you got this guy. He's putting across the desert. Okay, brokenhearted, got his dog in the car, and his car is barely making it. Okay, he's getting there. He's getting there. He finally gets to California, and guess where he gets to California? His car slowly makes it into a garage that happens to be owned by a man named Glenn Payne. Now, Glenn Payne happens to be George Van Tassel's uncle. Ta-da! So now you see how this all comes together. This is weird how the universe works. So Frank Kreitzer, this guy, meets George Van Tassel in his uncle's Santa Monica garage, and he goes, "Hey man, my car just broke down. Can you help me out? I don't have any money, don't have anything." And they become friends. And after a while, Frank stayed on the coast. He got a little bit of a job. They worked on his car, put it all back together. Van Tassel and Glenn Payne, they all became friends. And at one point, Frank turns around and says, "Hey man, I'm done. I'm done with the coast. I'm leaving. I'm heading out. I'm going to become a miner. I'm heading off to other places." Now, what they had done originally, they had done a thing called grub staking him. What it was is when Frank left the garage in Santa Monica, if Frank hit it big in gold mining, that eventually George and his uncle would get a percentage of whatever he would get. George definitely would be coming back and forth from Santa Monica to be good friends with Frank. And while he was out here, Frank Kreitzer, what he is known for, if you look at this is the outside of Giant Rock. And to this very day, you can go out there and you can see there's markings on the rock. They're like little cement markings. These are where you can see where he left and held his boxes. And this is how he dug out from underneath the rock. And he used picks and dynamite. Frank Kreitzer was responsible for digging under the rock. He made a 400 square foot room under the rock, and it was perfect ventilation because he made it so the air would go in, and it made it perfect in the summer, perfect ventilation in the summer, and perfect in the winter, kept him warm in the winter. It's him there looking at his work. You can also notice that there's some markings there, and you can see on the rock where there will be marks where this doorway was plugged into the rock. You can still see the holes. Frank Kreitzer was the man who was responsible for building Giant Rock Airstrip. He was the guy, 40 miles, and many of those roads that you still drive out there today, he himself is responsible for making. However, what was really going on for Frank Kreitzer out there was he was an opportunist, okay? And what his big motive was for having that, he really enjoyed and he wanted people to come to his rock. He was in advertisings, magazines, the AAA magazines, the LA Times travel sections, and he was inviting people to come see his home, lived under the ground. People, 300 in attendance for a PTA picnic. He was more of a guy who wanted to have people come visit his home. But the US government was also very suspicious of what he was doing out here, okay? Here you have this giant rock out here. You have people coming out here, landing. They were so curious. They actually investigated him out here. They sent people out here to inspect it all, and he was cleared. Couldn't find anything, but they still had him in the radar. And Frank, because he had a radio and he had communications out, he was always under suspicion. And something happened on July 1st, 1942. The US government made a change in their rulings. You know, here we are in the World War, and they came up with something known as the Fourth Draft, and it was known as the Old Man's Draft. And it was requiring men between the ages of 18 to 64 to register for the draft. Then the Riverside Police, who were his friends, by the way, they made regular visits out to the rock. They actually went out there and told old Frank, said, you need to register for the draft. You know, Banning's far. Why don't we take you over there, get you registered? Frank, knowing differently, knowing that if he left the rock, somebody from the government's coming in, they're raking over my place. He's not stupid. The thing you need to understand is that these officers were friends, especially one of them. He actually came out here to the rock quite often and talked with Frank. But Frank knew that he was not going to be going with him. And in some of the writings that I have gotten from the family, they talk about how paranoid Frank used to be and how Frank used to always walk around with belts of dynamite around his waist. He was always kind of prepared for something to happen. And that day, the police, the sheriffs came out. They offered to take him to Banning. Frank said, nope, ain't going. And he walked into the back room, said, I'm going to get my hat. He had a pair of binoculars. And he had like two wires that were hung off the binoculars, and he came out and he says, to quote him, "Are you going to go away and leave me alone, or are we all going to hell together?" And then he took the two wires, he put them together, and proceeded to blow himself apart. And one of the ribs flew out and was impaled into one of the officers. One of the other officers was blown up outside the rock, and all his clothes came off. And the other officer who was outside just stood outside, kind of in shock over the whole thing. To put it all bluntly, this was the death certificate that the family did receive, and in it, even though his name is spelled with a C, it is called Frank Kreitzer took his own life by blowing himself to pieces, was being questioned by deputy sheriffs regarding his failure to register for service when he touched off an electric charge, body at Wilson Mortuary, Victorville, awaiting for disposition. His body is buried in Victorville if anybody wants to go visit Frank Kreitzer. His family, in conversations that his family has written back and forth to him, they wrote, "Stay away from Frank. He's gone to the dark side." So at some point, his own family had recognized or was making notations saying that they thought he had flipped. Going back to George Van Tassel, you have a man now, and here he goes, "Oh my gosh, my friend is gone. He's dead." And over the course of this period of time, there was a 3-year period, and eventually George came out to Giant Rock, and in 1947, George Van Tassel and Ava Van Tassel leased the 4 square miles of Giant Rock from the Bureau of Land Management. That's something that Frank Kreitzer didn't do. Frank Kreitzer squatted the land. He never owned it. So he just kind of came in and just squatted. And George, when he came in, it's been written that George actually, what he intended to do, George Van Tassel actually was looking to make a dude ranch up here. You have to go back to wondering, who was George Van Tassel? What brought this man who was living in Santa Monica with a wife and 3 daughters, okay? He was originally born in Jefferson, Ohio. At age 17, he had $300 and he made his way to Chicago where he went to airplane school. Airplane school, don't you like that? You know? Then after the stock market crashed, he came out, he went to California. Of course, everybody comes to California. It's the place to be. He married his wife, Ava, and then he started to work at his uncle, Glenn Payne, that little garage where he met Frank Kreitzer. And then 1941, he interviewed at Douglas Aircraft. That same year, he interviewed and switched to Howard Hughes, where he worked as an experimental aircraft as an inspector. And then in 1944, he switched to Lockheed and worked on modifying aircraft. So he kind of held a lot of different jobs in a short period of time. But his favorite thing was driving out here to the desert, enjoying his friendship with Frank Kreitzer. And after Frank Kreitzer died, that's when he came out here and homesteaded Giant Rock. He gave up his city life in 1947, and he moved his wife and 3 daughters. Now, okay, you live in Santa Monica, you have a job, and your husband comes into you someday and says, "Hi, hon, guess what? We're gonna go and we're gonna pack up and we're gonna go live under a rock in the desert." No air conditioning, no electricity, and we're gonna go live under a rock. Yeah, and sweet Ava, she went away along with it. I mean, come on, you know? So in 1947, they filed the paperwork for Giant Rock Airport. It's an official airport, still filed on the records today. And to make her happy, he built her a little restaurant. It was a 6-stool restaurant where she made hamburgers and apple pie. And many of the locals here will still tell you about it. They love it. They would go there and they would eat the hamburgers, eat the apple pies. And what it's most known for is for Howard Hughes flying his airplane out here to get a piece of that apple pie. In 1951, he bought the ranch from Charlie Ritchie and enlarged the restaurant. And what was really interesting, though, is this is what he's most famous for, is he had an experience out at Giant Rock. And he claims that there was a spaceship that came down one night on the airstrip. These guys were from Venus. And they basically told him, they said, you know what, you humans, you're doing okay. You're coming along okay as a species, you know, nothing to complain about. However, it seems by the time you get it, you die, you know? So what we want to do is we want to give you some information. We want to give you some technology that's going to help extend your life, help you in your healing. So, wow, you know, so George Van Tassel became known as the first space channeler because he would receive this information from the people from Venus, and it was the information on how to build the Integratron and how to put the Integratron together. But to build an Integratron, whatever an Integratron is, it costs money. And how do you do that? He had to start a foundation called the College of Universal Wisdom, and then he would hold spacecraft conventions out there. And the first one was held on April 4th, 1953. And that's what it looked like at that time. And there's that little restaurant. Isn't that adorable? This was the restaurant. That's what it looked like in June of 1966. That was the advertisement. When you take the road going up to Giant Rock, that was an airplane wing. And that's how they would advertise to go to the airport. And this is what the pad looked like in 2017. Life magazine became real interested in what was going on out here. And they did a whole expose on it, pictures and everything. And they would come out and take pictures and explain what was going on. This was inside the magazine. And it reads, photo entitled, Stuck Up Little Car, and showed a Chrysler automobile sitting on top of Giant Rock. The caption read, G.W. Van Tassel of Joshua Tree, California, is proud owner of the world's largest boulder. Okay, who's going to ask it? How did they get it up there? No, actually, it was really quite simple. A Chrysler was tiny little cars. And the people here, they took the engine out of it, and off the other end of it, they had a winch, and they just were able to put it up there, and it was basically hollowed out, and they were there. I show some of the crowds because at one time it's noted that there could be as many as 13,000 to 15,000 people that were going out to Giant Rock. And it was I compare it to like the Burning Man of its time. And what was so popular and why it was bringing in so many people is because during that period of time, people were looking for a way to express themselves. It was a way for them to tell their stories. You know, they didn't know about X-Files. They were just starting to know about government conspiracies. People didn't have a way of coming together and talking. This allowed people to come a free venue where they can come and express themselves. They can come together and speakers that were known at the time as contactees. And we have a friend of ours, a couple friends, Greg Bishop and Adam Gorightly wrote a book about this, and Jane. Jane also helped on this. And it's all about the contactee movement and people who helped bring these people together, and they would come out here to the desert and express themselves about what's going on with UFOs, what's going on in the government, what's going on all over the place. It was about a new movement. It was about thousands to attend these conventions and talk about understanding, peace, love. We're going from the 50s into the 60s, and you have flying saucers are real. They were seeing things in the sky, and but nobody would listen to them. We had to wait till the government has said, "Oh yeah, there's been things in the sky. Well, we just decided we never wanted to tell you." And this was all going on just down the road from you. Just down the road. Why it never caught on like the others, I don't know. I don't know. And I got a feeling its time is coming. People, what made this more unique than the others, people came in airplanes. They came in their campers. They came in their cars. They had 40 miles of roads to get here. People drove all over the place just to come to this giant rock, this giant boulder here in the middle of this desert, and listen to George Van Tassel and the other contactees talk. This is what would line up out there. It's kind of like it is starting to become now. We're coming full circle. Most of these rocks around the area are made of granite, but there's a hill behind Giant Rock that is made completely of white quartz, and it's called Crystal Hill. And I was told that at the time of the Native American time, this hill was so prominent that the quartz stuck up the top, and they actually were able to build chairs and sit in the quartz chairs that sat at the top. Over time, of course, because of OHV and people camping and doing what man normally does, all that is gone and it's completely worn down. But it is so against the geology that is normally in this area. And I would love to have a geologist study where that came from, how that got there, and why that's there. Part of it has to do with the gold mining. I know that much. It would be part of that related to Goat Mountain and the gold mine. The red mark there's the most UFO sightings on that line. But on that particular line, up in here alone and just in this area, this is where Giant Rock is. This is where the Phoenix Lights are. This is where Roswell is. This is where the Trinity, New Mexico is. These are Sedona, Area 51, LA area. This is just the United States. Now, if you take it across the rest of the world, the highest number of UFO sightings at Magnetic Mysteries are on this parallel line, the 33rd North Parallel. The 33rd is in Joshua Tree. The 34th is right here at Giant Rock. So you can see the distance is only by a mile or so. So we're not talking like we're crumpling little, crackers here. You're on this right now, the same energy line, the 33rd North Parallel, Roswell, Area 51, Phoenix Heights, Bermuda Triangle, Great Pyramid of Giza. Okay, I'm going to show you this because this has always been a hotbed for UFO sightings. It goes back to the 1960s. It happened out here at Giant Rock. It was very common in the 1960s. This area would put out newsletters. They would publish it in their newspapers about the seeing UFOs in this Morongo Basin. And I'm a skeptic. However, I've had things happen to me that make me go, huh? And this was one of them. On March 25th, 2015, I was with my friend, Jane, and we went to the Railroad Museum in Joshua Tree. My husband and I were in this little railroad car, and we're being tourists, and we're just waving, and she was taking a bunch of photos. She goes home, and she emails me a bunch of photos, and I email her back, and I went, ha ha, nice going, Jane, photoshopping a UFO in the picture. And she looks at me and goes, what are you talking about? I go, the UFO in the picture. Right up there, didn't you see it? She goes, what are you talking about? So we go into action and we start unraveling it, looking at it. Like, okay, did you spike this? What did you do to it? I didn't do anything to it. What are you talking about? So for many years now, and if you look closely, this is an actual jet that would be traveling probably close to 30,000 feet. This is the actual UFO blowing up over there, which is probably at about 4,500 feet. And where this is located at the railroad station in Joshua Tree is a common spot for UFO spotting. Just over the hill from here is where George Adamski had his first UFO sighting, was right in that spot too. The highway actually has an area of the highway named after him. Okay, so the College of Universal Wisdom was found by George Van Tassel. He never got a chance to see his Integratron completed. He died February 9th, 1978, and that was a model. He had a model of his work. What was the Integratron? It was a structure designed by George Van Tassel, and it was supposed to be capable of rejuvenating in anti-gravity and time travel. It was intentionally constructed on top of a powerful geomagnetic anomaly. When there is UFO contact, the one thing that you always find that where you have a lot of UFO contact, it's when you have the aquifers. The unique thing about the aquifers is in the center of the Integratron, there are 3 converging aquifers in the middle. There's also Goat Mountain in the back that has a gold mine, and you also have the Marine base, which is not far. Those are 3 recipes to entice and have UFO contact. It's constructed entirely of non-ferromagnetic material, which means it's all wood, no metal. It's a parabolic shape, sacred geometry, focuses and amplifies energy. So a lot of people say it has a look of the spruce goose. It would have a lot of that. Had a wooden frame, 38 foot high, 50 foot in diameter, built ton and groove like shipbuilders with no metal. They primarily use the Integratron now for sound baths. People often ask them if they're ever going to turn it on. The response is usually, how do you know it's not turned on already? Giant rock split February 21st, 2000, the day the mother declared a new era. Her take on it was, again, the story of the Hopis. If it split down the middle, mankind was doomed. And if it split to either side, we had a chance to go on living. That's the story of the spiritual side of it. However, the actual thing that happened was that there was a man who had a Volkswagen engine. They had it right up underneath there, and they caught it on fire. And if anybody knows anything about Volkswagen engines, they have a high magnesium burn, and they caught fire. It burned really hot, really fast. Also see some of these rust stains. You would notice that that is where they would plug in and hammer the speaker stands. So there were stress fractures in the rock itself. I don't disregard anybody's belief system in why the rock would split and the spiritualism behind it, because again, that rock is millions of years old. And I always go back to the simple question of why did it pick that day? When I saw it split, I was devastated. I thought, oh, I was so sad. But then when I saw it and I leaned up against it, I had a feeling come over me and and what I got, and I heard the rock say, "Why are you sad?" It says, "Because I have held on to all this information for millions of years. And now when it split, she split, and all I kept seeing were like library cards, and they were opening up, and they were sending information off into the ethers. And so for me, she was sending off information into the world, and she was saying that mankind was ready now to accept the information that she had held on to for years. My challenge is keeping the rock clean. We've had several different things happen out there. We just recently had a cleanup out there, but everybody knows who lives out here that is the challenge of what our goal is for Giant Rock. It's getting better. It's getting better over the years as time is going on. So I thank you all for listening to me chatter on for hours. I'm going to have some new websites coming up. I'm going to be called the Giant Rock Lady. Frank Kreitzer dug so far into the rock at one time that he actually hit a cavern. He came to a hollow space where he was describing stalactites and things that would be sparkling off the ceilings and stuff. He had different descriptions for it, and he immediately filled it back up because he figured that he was going to be living in a hollow shell above it, and because he was going to be doing that, he figured he wanted to have it more secure and not so hollow underneath him, so he filled it back up. This area is filled with a lot of open caverns, you might say, and empty aquifers that were left over from, again, getting into the geology. That's a whole other topic of how that rock got there and what it's doing there and where it's going.